Well, it's not an analogy at all. Let me explain the Great Western Schism. I have to go back into the Middle Ages in order to describe it. Rome was always the scene of violent mobs, and I say always from the 10th century on. There was always a presence of powerful families who wanted to control the papacy and control who would be elected. And they would always put up their favorite nephew or something like that. And there would be all sorts of strife about who was pope. And there were many anti-popes during this time because these families would elect their own anti-popes, and the true pope would be driven out. And the 10th century, 11th century, to a certain extent, the 12th century also saw some of that. But with the advent of Pope Gregory VII, Saint Pope Gregory VII, in the middle of the 1000s, so the middle of the 11th century, or toward the end of the 11th century, he created the College of Cardinals. And that was to stabilize the election of popes, because up to that time it was up to the Roman clergy in general, and the people would respond, and in sort of by acclamation, and it was informally done. And so he established the College of Cardinals, and that gave great stability to the papacy for a long time. But there were still Roman mobs, and the true popes had to take refuge very often in France, because France was peaceful. The monarchs were very favorable to the papacy. France was a very pious place, and so they could protect their own persons and also rule the church in peace from France. So they took refuge in France from time to time, but not for very long. It was just get out of Rome until it settles down. So, Rome was generally the place where popes resided, but they also took refuge in other parts of Italy because Rome was just uninhabitable. So you have to understand that as background. So there was, now going back to the beginning of the 1300s, there was a pope elected in Rome, but he was French. And that was Clement V. And he was a true pope. And he decided, I don't want to reside in Rome. I want to remain in France, and I will set up the Holy See in a place called Avignon in France, in order to avoid the Roman mobs and all sorts of chaos in Rome. And that he did. And there were a number of popes who reigned there very peacefully, but they all knew that it was not ideal, because they appeared to be the altar boys of the French monarch in Avignon. And this was a very sensitive time, because England and France were in the throes of the 100 Years' War. They were having a major war over succession, and who is the king of France and who was not the king of France, and how big France would be, etc. I won't get into that, but it was a major war. It ended with Saint Joan of Arc. France prevailed with the help of God through Saint Joan of Arc. So that was in the 1400s. But so the politically, it just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth that he was residing in France. So they all had this intention of getting back to Rome, but Rome was uninhabitable, so they just couldn't do it. So finally, Urban V in the late 1300s decided, well, I'm going to do it. So he went back to Rome, stayed there for a while, and then, because Rome was uninhabitable again, decided to go back to Avignon. And so against the advice of Saint Catherine of Siena, who told him that if he goes back to Avignon, he would die shortly thereafter. And of course he did. A few months after, like 2 or 3 months after he went back to Avignon, he was dead. So then his successor, Gregory the Ninth, I'm pretty sure it's the Ninth, again returned to Rome and resided there and died in Rome. So when he passed away, there was an election that was conducted by the cardinals, and the Roman mob was crying out for a Roman or at least an Italian. So they were in the streets, a Roman or at least an Italian. We want an Italian, at least. So, but we know in hindsight that they were completely free in the election. They all did obeisance to the person they elected, and that was Urban VI. Obeisance means they go up and show him signs of obedience and accept him as Pope, and they all took part in his coronation. So there was no question, despite the mob and everything, that they were in any way under fear to vote for Urban VI. So everything was fine for a few months, except that Urban VI became overbearing as a pope and made himself very unpopular among the cardinals. He also wanted to reform their ways because in Avignon they became worldly, and he wanted to reform their ways. So a number of cardinals decided he had to go, and so they had a conclave in the northern part of Italy, electing a different pope, a cardinal by the name of Robert of Geneva, who took the name of Clement VII. Now, he tried to oust Urban VI in Rome, but it didn't work. So he retired to Avignon. And so there were two popes, and supposedly, and the cardinals said, who voted for Clement VII, said we were under pressure. This was 5 months after the fact of the election of Urban VI. 5 months went by before they had qualms of conscience that they were under fear, and therefore you had an invalid election. And this, as I said, is in the context of Urban becoming overbearing and obnoxious. And that's true. I mean, it's not a calumny. It's just he just was not, he did not rule well. And so he irritated them. And so they had the qualms of conscience, and so they went and elected their own pope. So then you had a split in Christendom where you had essentially France and Spain, including the Kingdom of Naples, which was southern Italy, adhering to the Avignon Pope, and everybody else, England, Ireland, Germany, Austria, Poland, and a lot of minor places, smaller places, and northern Italy adhering to the Roman Pope. So now, very important point. Each one excommunicated the other pope and the followers of the other pope. So that's a very important point. There is some idea among lay people that, well, there was confusion and then nobody really knew, and it didn't matter which pope you supported. That's just not true. It was taken very seriously, because the Pope is the principle of unity of the Roman Catholic Church. So you cannot not excommunicate somebody that is claiming to be a Pope if you are the true Pope. It's impossible. You can't just say, well, wish you the best, and I'm sure all of your followers are in good conscience. You cannot do that. Even if they are in good conscience, you cannot do that. You have to have objective reality prevailing. Now, remember that we live in an age of subjectivism, and we tend to justify our consciences, make that our consciences dictate our morality, and that's not true. Consciences merely apply the law, the objective law. They do not dictate morality. So that people might be in good conscience following a false pope has really nothing to do with the reality. And by in good conscience, I mean through ignorance about really who is the pope, They say, well, I think the Avignon Pope is the real Pope. That does not have anything to do with reality and does not justify. All it does is excuse them from the sin of schism because of their ignorance concerning it. See, it's much easier for us to look at the whole situation from afar after we have seen documents, after we have done the historical research. It's very clear that the Roman Pope was the true Pope. But at the time, you didn't have internet, you didn't have all of the information that is so easily communicated today. And people thought, well, the popes were in Avignon for all that time, and why not? So it is called by historians a schism without schismatics. That is, that everyone who supported either the Avignon Pope or the Roman Pope was acting in good conscience and therefore was not guilty of the sin of schism. But objectively, they were in schism if they were supporting the wrong Pope. Objectively. In other words, you cannot alter reality by your conscience. You can only excuse yourself from sin by ignorance. So, that being said, you had a problem only of election in that time. Because actually a third Pope was elected eventually. But I won't go into that. But so you had really three popes by the 1400s. You had three popes, the early 1400s. And so the point is that any one of them would have made a great pope in the sense that they all had the faith, they all professed the faith, and had many other virtues. Not one of them was able to be criticized for his inability to be the Pope. And that, because it was only a problem of election and not of faith, lies the essential difference between the great Western schism and what we are living today. Today, I think some people might contest the election of Bergoglio and the post-Vatican II popes based on their lack of faith. There are some that do that. But I would say most people are not concerned about the validity of the election, how it took place, of Bergoglio or John Paul II or any of those people. I don't think they're concerned about it. The reason why we are going to the traditional Mass, the reason why we defy the local bishop, the Novus Ordo bishop, and defy Francis, and go to something that is unauthorized by them, is because they are imposing upon us a false religion. If they were not imposing upon us a false religion, we would be in their churches, because we have no intention to be separated from the Catholic hierarchy. So the essential point is they are forcing this new religion upon the Catholic Church. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. So that's an essential difference between a problem of election, because that means that it is intrinsically impossible that they be popes, because they would be, in that case, altering the Catholic religion and therefore making the Catholic Church, by the authority of Christ supposedly invested in them, making it defect from its essence that Christ gave it. That is unthinkable from the point of view of Catholic faith, because indefectibility means that the Church must endure both as an institution until the end of time and according to the constitution and essence that Christ gave it. In other words, it cannot merely endure as an institution like a nation would or a corporation would. Not merely, that's not sufficient. And what is more important is that it have the same characteristics, the same essence, that is the same doctrines, substantially the same liturgy, substantially the same sacraments, everything substantially the same from the time of Christ to the second coming of Christ. That is the definition of indefectibility. So if the authority of Christ, supposedly invested in these men, is telling us to abandon the faith from before Vatican II and give us a new religion, if that is what indeed they're doing, then you have immediately a problem of indefectibility. Now, indefectibility is of faith. We must believe that that is true by faith. So, the faith, therefore, dictates to us that you must draw the conclusion that these men who are posing as the hierarchy of the church, but who are forcing upon us, excuse me, a false religion, cannot be the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. That is the clear logic of it. And so there is no analogy between merely a confusion about election of people who would be perfect candidates for the papacy and who did not attempt in any way to change the Catholic religion. There's no analogy at all between that and what we're facing now. In fact, there is nothing in the history of the church that is analogical to what we're facing now, what I have just described.
And people, not even theologians, have conceived of a problem or a crisis as the one we are living today. Even when theologians spoke about heresy in the Pope, it's a complete different topic, because we are not dealing here with the heretical Pope controversy. This is completely different. It's about the new false religion that is being professed and promulgated by the so-called hierarchy, the Catholic hierarchy.
Yes, a lot of people look to heretical popes in the past, popes who supposedly said heretical things or became heretics. Supposedly, that would be another video to do. But again, there's no analogy there because, as you said, all of the theologians, many theologians speculated about a heretical pope. And they gave various responses to it, how you would deal with a heretical pope. But we are not dealing with that problem. We are, it would not be a problem for us from day to day if someone was accusing the Pope of heresy, but we could still go to our local parish and have Mass and sacraments, and our Catholic schools were working properly, and the whole church was working properly, but maybe there was something wrong with the Pope. It'd be like if he went insane, for example, if he came out on the balcony dressed as George Washington and thought he was General George Washington. This man is insane. He doesn't even know who he is. And there would be the same thing. Life would go on in the church, but somehow the authorities of the church would have to deal with an insane man, somebody who has lost his mind and cannot function anymore. As bad as insanity is with regard to the functioning of the papacy, imposing heresy far exceeds insanity. Give us 10 insane popes rather than a pope that is imposing heresy. Even a heretical pope, a personally heretical pope, is far worse than an insane pope. An insane pope could really do no serious harm. But a heretical pope potentially could. But the point is that no theologian ever conceived of a hierarchy imposing a false religion on the Catholic Church. And there is absolutely no precedent for that, and really no one comments on it. So to look for certain principles among the theologians of how to deal with this, you will not find them, because they did not address this situation, not at all. But I think if they had addressed it, they would have told us to do exactly what we're doing. And to say necessarily these people are a false hierarchy.